Hello, welcome back. I hope you all are doing well. I am working on grading a lot of your material, and I think everything's going really well. I'm very pleased with how everything's going so far. And I hope you have looked at the lectures as we go along here. And I wanted to do one lecture for today. I'll do one on Christianity here with you today, and another on Islam. Just looking ahead. All right. Our midterm is going to come after the module on Islam. Very soon here, I will have a review sheet up there, and we'll talk a little bit about how the midterm is going to work. All right. Midterm will be one of the very few sort of timed things in our class. All right. You'll have a week to do it, but it will be due. It'll be a little less flexible than some of the other things. But I'm sure, get that fan out of there, that you guys will all do well at it. All right. So today we're going to talk about the development of early Christianity and the expansion of Christianity into different cultures outside of the Middle East. And the main way we're going to do that is by explaining and looking at what are called parables. All right. Now, I did a few things in the module there. I got a parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke and put a Word document there. So it's probably going to be real helpful if you want to pause here and go find that. I know in your book they had these other parables, but I like the Good Samaritan parable. So that's the one that I did for today. So I'm gonna get this going here. Okay, now, just 1 second to start the slideshow. Okay, now, first of all, what is a parable? I know you've all probably heard that term before, and here I'm going to use it in a relatively specific sort of a way. All right. So let's just get right into the history. Okay. So, one of the things that it's very important to understand in a class like this, as we're looking at the larger arc of history and the development of religion, is that Christianity, okay, followers of the Christ, begin as a subset of Judaism. Now, a few things. We don't know if Jesus really died at 0. All right. That has been sort of something that Western civilization has done just because we're all bad at math and it's easier. We don't really know the dates, and they don't particularly matter. The point is that the earliest followers of Jesus did not consider themselves to be a new religion. All right. They considered themselves to be a subset or a sect, if you're being mean, within the larger culture of Judaism. Okay. Now, this runs from the life and death of Jesus up until a date that we do know, which is 69 AD. I have it as CE, Common Era. Now, in 69, there is a revolt in Judea. The Jewish people had not liked living under Roman rule. There had been several other revolts, but this is a really big revolt in Judea. All right, the Judean people rise up. They briefly kick the Romans out of Jerusalem, and there's a great deal of fighting throughout the Roman province of Judea. Now, eventually, as happens with almost all revolts with the Romans, right, the Jewish rebels are crushed. And they are isolated into 2 separate spots, all right, one being Jerusalem, the other being a mountain temple that's called Masada. And the Jews at Masada hold out until the very end. The Romans build this crazy giant thing all the way up to Masada. And when they finally break through, everybody inside the temple and inside the fortress had killed themselves. So it's kind of one of those losing for winning kind of situations. The siege of Jerusalem is incredibly terrible. We know because of the historian Josephus, all right, who tells us that The Romans were able to cut off all food getting into the city. They were able to cut off the water supply eventually. There were reports of cannibalism. And the Romans finally break through. And in true Roman fashion, when they break through, they literally kill anything that moves. And importantly, the Romans destroy the Jewish temple. All right. Jewish religious practice had been focused around the temple on making sacrifices at the temple. And the only thing, of course, that remains from that temple today is the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. So after 69 AD, only two forms of Judaism really survive at all. The first is largely what we have today in the Jewish community, which we call Rabbinic Judaism, all right, focused around the rabbi and everything that goes along with that. The second kind of Judaism to survive the revolt is Christianity. Now, Christianity in these early days is a weird little fledgling sort of a religion, all right? The first thing you should start to know is that it is not recognized by the Roman Empire, okay? Making it an illicit or illegal religion. So it has to be practiced on the down low, in people's houses, hidden away. Despite this, Christianity begins to move into different parts of the ancient world, all right? And it spreads up into what is today Turkey, what we call Asia Minor, and it spreads a lot in Greece. Now, wherever Christianity goes, all right, basically, you have people within those local communities, all right, taking the stories of Jesus, all right, which at this point are an oral tradition, and trying to fit them into the cultural peg of wherever they are, okay? So you're going to explain who Jesus was very differently if you have an all Jewish audience or if you don't. Now, in particular books in the Gospels, all right, we see signs that some authors know a lot about Jewish culture and some don't. All right. Now, in Mark, all right, in Luke, we see a mix. Okay. We often see the authors of a gospel telling us what Passover is. Okay. Now, if your audience was a group of Jewish people, they obviously know what Passover is. So if you tell us that, that means that you are talking to non-Jewish people. Now, the Gospel of Luke is particularly interesting because we know a few things, all right? The oldest copies of this that we have that are actually written in Greek are written in quite eloquent Greek, all right? Greek would have been the language around which these things would have been written. They're written about 100, say, in the Common Era, somewhere around there. And the Gospel of Mark, which is actually our oldest gospel, the Greek is very crude. It's obviously a second or third language. But for Luke, the Greek is flawless. It's really nice. What Luke is trying to do, which makes his gospel, in my opinion, very, very interesting, okay, is he is trying to talk to two different narratives at one time. All right, he is clearly speaking to a Jewish community and a non-Jewish community. Now, when Christianity goes into Greece, people trying to explain who Jesus was, okay, didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Greek people already had half man, half God stories. Okay, they already had cults which involved ritual purification. All these parts of the Christianity that we have today were already present just in other sorts of religious traditions. So in Greece, kind of you just had to tell this story, right? About a teacher, a half man, half God, ritual purification. Greeks understood these things. So the Jesus that comes through in the Gospel of Luke is this sort of hodgepodge, all right, of a certain comment on Jewish religious life and this Greek vision. All right, so let's talk a little bit about parables. Parables, okay, are stories, all right, that convey religious or cultural truth. And the way that they do this is they do this by telling sort of everyday stories, right? They take a complex idea and they tell a story that the people around could relate to. So often in parables, we see farmers, we see everyday kinds of folks, right? And the point of a parable is that it's relatively disarming to our brain. If I tell you right away, okay, we're going to learn some complicated, crazy new idea, your brain kind of tenses up, right? But if I say, okay, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy that has some sheep, and you're like, hey, I got some sheep. I know people who have sheep. I know sheep. So the point of a parable is that it is supposed to introduce complex religious ideas in a way that a larger group of people can understand. Now, what's awesome about parables from our perspective, okay, is that they often contain sort of cultural nuggets that we may miss along the way. Everything in a parable is a symbol. But 2,000 years later, we don't get all the symbols, okay? So we get the basic point of the parable, and we're going to look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I think is relatively understandable. There are some parables, I'm sorry, I have these terrible allergies, in the Bible that are really difficult to understand because we just don't get it. Okay, we don't have enough of the cultural markers that tell us what the heck is going on. So they're fun little nuts to crack, right? What's really going on here? Now, parables are very important in Jewish popular culture at the time of Jesus, and they bleed through into Christianity that way. Okay, well, now, Jesus tells a lot of parables. All right, they are all over the Gospels. And again, they're sort of a folksy way, all right, of telling people what the proper way to act is, and seemingly from a Christian perspective, right, what God wants you to do in your life. They are a response against a very formulaic, legalistic type of Jewish religious tradition. All right. Um, so the parables often reveal certain things that are unfair. All right. They compare two things to each other. That's a big one. And as we'll see, all right, a parable is supposed to be a way where you hear a parable and you think, oh, I'm maybe not doing something right in my life and I should change that around. Okay, so again, definition of a parable, a story that uses metaphors based on daily life, okay, to convey these religious truths. If you're trying to introduce new ideas into a community, really the best way to try and do it, and Christianity is not very good at this, but they will learn as we move along, okay, is to understand how people in that particular culture express these views and then adapt whatever your message is to that. All right. Comes from a Greek word, okay, meaning comparison. Again, a parable takes one thing, compares it to another thing. Oh, I never thought of it that way. All right. It's supposed to try to adjust the way that you see religious experience and the way you live your life. But again, for us in this class as historians, right, parables are cool little cultural nuggets that we can mine to find interesting and different ways of expressing them. Okay, so the way that Jesus uses parables, again, uses elements of everyday life, all right, to appeal to his audience. One of the main differences of the way that Jesus and Christianity expands is that Jesus told whoever would listen that basically everybody was capable of receiving God's love. And if you think about a very old fashioned, rusty, legalistic interpretation of the Torah, that's not really true. All right. The Jews are the chosen people of God. Non Jews, not so much. So, one of the things one of the radical elements of Jesus's teachings is the fact that everybody can play. Everybody's invited. So usually, all right, parables are a story that you think is going one way, and then they kind of turn and go another way. All right, they get us to rethink things by doing something different. Parables are usually about God, all right, about our relationship with God, about our actions in the world. Okay, I think I've probably beaten this to death. All right. Again, parables are for religious instruction, a way of explaining ideas that are outside of your common reality by using your common reality. For us, for the historians, for people in humanities class, they're a fascinating way to get a glimpse into what was the everyday reality of people in Jesus's time, right? Jesus wouldn't use examples in a parable if people wouldn't understand them. So if we look at the examples that are used in the parables, this gives us a decent vision of what everyday life was like in first century Palestine. So that's why the parables are really interesting to study. That's why they're interesting to try and unpack. All right. And that's why we are going to look at them. Okay. Back to Luke. All right. So again, Luke is meant for these two different audiences. There were people called God-fearers in Greece who were not Jews, but they were sort of involved in Jewish religious practice. And Luke is one of the gospel writers, right, who has a very good command of Greek, but also a fairly solid knowledge of Jewish tradition. Again, probably coming from this God-fearer class of people, again, who were not Jewish, but they had a good understanding of Jewish culture and Jewish religious life. Now, I've called this dual narrative theory, right? Because what I'm saying is that the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke has two different audiences, and what each audience gets out of the parable is very, very different. Now, this is kind of my theory, but just roll with it. I think you'll find it interesting. Now, the parables in Luke can be read with or without that's nice, knowledge of Jewish culture. Just like we can read these parables without truly understanding all the cultural references, and we basically think we get the point. But I'm going to try to convince you that there are some things that are lost unless you know all of the little goodies to try to figure out the message. All right. So again, I put that Word doc there. It has the parable. And so I would go and look at it and read it, maybe even pause this right now and go do that. And then we're going to get into the parable itself just a little bit. Okay. So throughout the Gospels, all right, there are these times when the Gospel writers set up what should be familiar to you after reading The Cave, okay? Because this is very, very similar to a way someone would have come and started asking questions, right, of Socrates, the way that Plato writes. And again, in a Greek setting, educated Greeks would have felt comfortable in this sort of a dialogue, a dialectic, okay? The Socratic method. That's basically what we're seeing here. So on one occasion, an expert in the law. Now, no Jewish author would call somebody an expert in the law. There are other words for that. And I've highlighted here the word teacher. Now, you wouldn't call somebody a teacher, you'd call them a rabbi. Okay, so here we know that Luke is sort of projecting this story out to be intelligible for both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. So this law expert, all right, asks a fundamental question within the Christian faith. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Basic question, okay? Now, Jesus turns around with another question. Again, this should look familiar, the Socratic method. Question upon question upon question. So he replies, all right, what is written in the law? And how do you read it? Okay, so he is taking this question, this challenge, turning it on his head, handing it back to someone. Very classic Socratic method. Now, this expert in law seems to have done mostly his homework, okay, because he talks about the first two commandments, all right? Love the Lord God, okay, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, Jesus is quoted at other points throughout the Bible in saying that really there are only two commandments. Now, he stole this from a man named Hillel the Elder, okay, who was a very important scholar and rabbi around the time of Jesus, around his location. And they both say that the first two commandments are really all you need. All right, you love God, you love your neighbor. Life is simple. Okay, Jesus says, all right, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. So it kind of looks like our story's over, right? But this is a parable. So the story then takes a turn. Now, this is a very important passage, and it's often read, we read right over it. The man wanted to justify himself. Now, that is the author of Luke throwing shade at a very legalistic interpretation of religion. All right, Luke is trying to separate, in a way, Jesus from this older tradition. Okay, a very legalistic tradition in which you followed the rules and everything is okay. And what Luke is saying here is that the man is seeking to justify himself through following the law, which is not the reason you're supposed to follow the law. You're supposed to follow the law because it's the right thing to do, and because then you believe you will lead a good life and go to heaven. He wants to justify himself. The law is made by men to justify men. That is some serious shade that the author of Luke, okay, is throwing at the previous Jewish tradition. So the man then asks an absolutely fundamental question in Christianity and expressing the difference between early Christianity, again, and early Judaism. Who is my neighbor? Now, this is a question we need to ask ourselves today. This is the question that lies fundamentally at the center of Christianity. All right, if the two most important commandments are to love God and to love your neighbor, who is your neighbor? Now, an ancient understanding of your neighbor would not be just the guy who lived right next to you on either side, right? The term neighbor would have been a member in good standing of your community. And so what we're seeing here is there's an attempt to define who is the community. All right, is it simply the Jews? Is it everybody who believes in God? So for, a small passage, there is a lot that is packed in here. This is one of the main fights of early Christianity within, say, the first 200 years of the Christian faith, trying to define who's part of the club. Do I owe this to everybody? Like even the Romans that like put me on stakes and light me on fire? That seems hard. So who is the neighbor? Who do I owe this love? And again, not to get up on my soapbox, but we're still struggling with this, right? Okay. So Jesus then begins to tell the story. And again, this is classic parable, and you think it's kind of over, and then it gives you the rope-a-dope. And here's the important part. All right. So man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, anybody in a Jewish audience at this point would say, ooh, yeah. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously dangerous. It was like if you started out a story in Albuquerque and you were like, I was wandering around the International District. And you'd be like, ooh, I don't know what comes next, but it might be bad. Now, of course, if you were just some Greek dude sitting there, you wouldn't care about that. It doesn't seem like a major thing. But, the Jewish audience knows that road and knows how dangerous it is. So if you are traveling along that road, all right, symbolically, it is set with peril. And sure enough, he was attacked by robbers. Now, this sets this man in a context, okay? You're traveling along the road. You're probably going to Jericho to do business. All right, moving from Jerusalem to Jericho is dangerous. There is a sense of geography here that's really important. So he gets attacked by robbers. No one likes being attacked by robbers. Now, the next sentence, okay, they strip him of his clothes. Ooh, again, the Greek side is going to be all, that's no good. Nudity, all right, for the ancient Israelite and Jewish community, public nudity, not okay. All right, the Greeks are a little more free and fancy, and they run around and they wrestle each other, and there's a whole nother thing going on over here. Not over here. All right, public nudity, big no-no, really a scary part. They're already pretty scared by this, all right? So they beat him up. I don't know why they take his clothes off and then beat him up, but they beat him up and they went away, leaving him by the side of the road, half dead. All right, now, people by the side of the road, Jewish culture, generally considered dirty, unclean. We're on a public road. We're on a dangerous road. If you are just lying there by the side of the road, not good, not okay at all. Now, here's where we really get to the meat of things, okay? A priest, and again, we know this is Greek because if this was written to a Jewish audience, you wouldn't call it a priest. You would be more specific than that, maybe a Pharisee, but we're in the Greek land, so there's a priest, okay? Now, the priest here is a symbol of religion, of orthodoxy, of practice, okay? Priest comes down the road, sees the guy, crosses over to the other side. All right, he avoids him entirely. So this man is not saved by someone who does the religious practices of traditional Judaism. So to a Levite, all right, a practicer of the law, a practicer of the cultural practices, comes, passes to the other side. Wow. Okay, so again, if you are a Greek member of the audience, you feel bad for this guy. You're like, gosh, those other two guys, they should have been nicer to him. If you are a Jewish member of the audience, this is relatively shocking to you, okay? Because again, we saw the little bit of shade that was thrown earlier. This is big time, massive shade thrown at the Jewish religious establishment. This is saying that when times get tough, both the practitioners of religion and the practitioners of the law will abandon you. Ouch. All right. Many of the Jews who had to flee Jerusalem after the Romans sacked it had to come down the same road. There's a lot of symbolism there. Basically, what the author of Luke is saying is that when the you-know-what hits the you-know-where, the two pillars of your Jewish society will abandon you. Ooh, all right. That is a haymaker right there. Okay. But a Samaritan. Now, who are the Samaritans? All right. There were a lot of different ethnic groups in ancient Judea. There were Hittites, Sumerians, all these different kinds of people. And basically, the most traditional vision of Jewish law thought that they were all pretty weird and dirty and wanted nothing to do with them. Really, nothing to do with them. So, whereas the Samaritan, becomes in Western culture simply an example of a person that helps you. Again, to an ancient Jewish audience, that would have been a very specific person, and it would have made the story kind of even worse. All right. There was a rivalry between the two peoples. There was often violence between the two peoples. Samaritans were, in a general term, pagans. All right. They were outside of the in group of Jewish culture. So it was this part of the story got even worse than the first part. All right. So he sees him and he takes pity on him. All right. He has a compassionate response. He bandages up his wounds. He touches him. Okay. Again, in a culture relatively obsessed with purity and ritual purity, touching someone by the side of the road who was all beat up, yuck. But the Samaritan does it. He bandages up his wounds. All right. He pours oil and wine on them. Both are expensive commodities. All right. So he um, uses some of his resources in order to fix this person that he doesn't even know. Okay. He puts him on his own donkey. He brings him to the inn and took care of him. Now he goes even farther, right? He takes 2 denarii, gives them to the innkeeper, says, look after him. So again, from the Jewish perspective, this is a complete frontal assault on all aspects of the culture which are supposed to protect you. All right. Luke is saying that those things are not worth their salt, that when you are in a dangerous time, as you will always be on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, those things will not help you. From a Greek perspective, again, it's a simple tale about helping other people. All right, so Jesus, through saying this, is saying, who is your neighbor? All right, your neighbor is basically anybody in need. Again, Jesus is expanding the in-group from a very specific set of people to basically everybody. Oh, let that sink in. Again, when we read this today, we think largely about the actions of the Samaritan. Upon imitating those actions, I hope you think that, about helping people who are in need. All good things. But there's this other narrative that's going on that if you're not in the know about, you're going to miss what an aggressive story this is, right? What an aggressive push this is against traditional Judaism, okay, and towards a more Christian vision, a more expansive vision of that basic question of who is your neighbor. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with Judaism or that Christianity has ever really lived up to the idea of the Samaritan, but we're in text here. All right, we're just talking about what's here. Now, we end then with our reflective question, as all parables do. All right, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Ouch, right? The religious professional, no. The follower of culture, no. The one who was outside your traditional community, but treated you with respect, all right? The one who helped you. So this is an attempt to answer that fundamental question, all right? It's also an attack on the traditional religious Jewish establishment. And it's just a really neat story, all right? There are lots of other parables. You have these other 3 parables here, all right? I hope I've set up the structure of a parable, how it kind of works. And again, how we see Luke using things that Greeks will understand, using things that Jews will understand, and trying to mix them into writing this relatively fiery story, all right, that I hope you've learned a little bit more about than your traditional interpretation. All right. I put a video up that's super, super long. You do not have to watch all of it. I also put, just for a little bit of fun, a Rolling Stones song that's from inspired by a parable. It's an old blues tune. And that's just a little bit of fun for you guys. Keep up your reading. I hope you are all staying safe. I hope you are all wearing masks and staying inside. We have some kind of bad numbers over the last few days. So let's try to get that better. All right. Take care.